Guten Morgen. Today is all about problem solving, well, kind of. You may know that in my latest video I made a dress where I was really excited about, but I ended up hating it. Well, hate is a strong word. I think I was mostly disappointed because the picture I had in my mind didn't really come through in the final piece. The dress itself isn't bad, it's just not what I wanted it to be, if that makes sense. And it's a little scary to share something I'm not 100% happy with because I am a little bit of a perfectionist. The dresses I usually post, and especially on Instagram, are the final product that I'm really proud of. But when I'm sharing the process on YouTube, it's inevitable that the things sometimes don't go as planned, and I can't really hide that. By that point, there's already been so much time and effort put into the project, and with deadlines to meet, sometimes you just have to let it go, and I'm currently learning to do that. So I thought we could use it as an opportunity to analyze the project a little bit. What I didn't like or which parts turned out differently than I expected, and I can tell you a little bit more about why I'm not happy with it. After that, we'll come up with a plan to turn the dress into something I'm hopefully happy with. To understand this video, it's not necessary that you have watched the other video, but if you're interested in the construction of the dress, feel free to go back and watch this video as well. So let's start with a little analysis. First off, unrelated to the design, the dress didn't fit quite right. I didn't mention that in the recap of the video because I filmed the reveal afterwards, but the neckline wrinkled a lot, especially around the gussets in the front. Since the mock-up fitted fine and in an earlier fitting that I didn't film, the corset also fitted well. I suspect that the fabric I used stretched a bit, so that's the first thing that we have to fix. The thing that annoys me most, though, is that the boning is hiding most of the design. I was really excited about the little pattern pieces between the bust gussets, but they ended up being covered completely. So whatever we do next, we need to make sure that the lines of the original design will stand out. Lastly, the different shades of white made the dress look a little bit pieced together. I'm thinking I'll use the existing dress as the inner structure for something new, so that should solve that problem. Also, I don't want to waste any fabric on that dress. I typically try to work with leftover fabrics from commissions or dead stock fabrics for my personal projects, and since I've already used a lot of fabric on this project, I want to make sure I'm only using fabrics I already have in my stash. So those are the main things that are bugging me and that I want to tackle in this video. And now that we know what needs to be changed, let's get to the planning. One thing I'm certain of is that I want to keep the corset as the foundation for something new, so that will be our base. I'm happy with the neckline and I want to make sure the front seams are visible. I also like the different sections of the skirt on the original white version, so I'll carry that over into the new design. I think the dress could use a little bit more drama. I want to keep the fabric simple, but I'm thinking of changing the skirt to add some flair. I want the waist to be defined at the front like it was before, but this time I'm going to raise the back of the skirt into watteau pleats. Hopefully this will give the dress the dramatic look it deserves. If I have enough fabric, I want the dress to be long. The fabric I have in mind is actually a dead stock fabric I brought a while ago and I already made the dress for my mom out of. It's got a really nice, elegant weight to it, so I think it would be perfect for this project. So now that we got the design in place, we can start to transform the original dress. First, we'll have to improve the fit of the original corset, and then it's time to move on to the new dress. So let's do this. Before we can continue working on the corset from the last dress, we have to remove a few things. At first, I put away the lacing for later, but I also had to remove other elements like the skirt panels, for example. Most of it was sewn onto the corset, so I had to remove the stitches, but some parts had to be cut away since the corset panels were longer in those areas. After removing the skirt, I noticed that the boning was poking out at the bottom of the channels, so securing it is something we have to do later as well. Next, I removed the gathering threads from the skirt. since I used large rectangular pieces for it that were simply sewn together at the sides, I can easily put it back in my stash to reuse the fabric later. Then I worked on the top of the corset. Here I removed the trim from the neckline, making sure not to damage it since I could use this part later on. To prepare it for reuse, I removed all the leftover threads and ironed it flat. The last step in preparing the corset was to remove the lining, and then I could start fixing it. The first thing I checked was whether the corset had stretched around the bust. I laid the pattern piece on top of it and could see that one piece of the corset had gotten slightly wider. To fix this, I simply sewed it smaller again and then added some of the petticoat fabric to the bust, making sure to use the correct fabric direction this time. After all of this, I noticed that the boning was poking out at the top as well, so fixing this became the next step. I took the ribbon that I had used for the neckline before and reattached it at the top. Then I folded it over the boning and pinned it in place. Afterwards, I sewed over all the seams from the boning channels on the ribbon again, so they were fully reinforced. The last steps were to sew in a waistband for extra support and to add additional boning to the center front.
So I've been wearing the corset for quite some time now just to check if it will start to wrinkle again, and I noticed it does, but only the fashion fabric I laid over the actual corset fabric wrinkles a little bit, so the problem probably is that I just combine two fabrics that don't really work together that well, but that's not really an issue because fabric I laid over it is so light that it won't be noticeable under the fabric I will layer over this one. So I don't think this will be a problem, and I really like the look of it. I think it feels amazing. It's tight, but it's not uncomfortable. And I think it now fits really well overall. I also added the ribbon at the bottom to make sure that the boning won't poke out. So the boning is secured. We removed the wrinkles, or at least the ones that are important, and we improved the fit around the bust, so all the points that had to be changed on the corsets are done now. I don't really like how messy it looks, obviously, because I just put stuff onto it so that it fits well, but it doesn't have to be pretty, it's only the inside, and here it's important that it fits, and we got this done. So I think we can put the corset aside now and start with the outer dress that will later go over it. I think that's it, so let's continue with the dress.
To start with the dress, I put the corset away for now to make room for the fabric we're using. It's this beautiful brown satin that reminds me of autumn, making it the perfect fabric for today. Since we didn't change anything with the pattern pieces, we could use them for the dress bodice as well. However, I put away the back panel because it is already covered with the lacing panel. All of the pattern pieces were then traced onto the fabric. I wanted to play a little with the sheen of the fabric, so I changed the direction of a few pieces. Then I added a 1 cm seam allowance before cutting them out. Even though the fabric is very beautiful, it is really difficult to cut since it somehow slips out of the scissors, but using smaller ones helped. After cutting out the pieces, I like to lay them out as they will be sewn together to ensure everything is correct. Then I chose a thread that matched the color best, and with that I could start sewing. Since the fabric is very prone to catching threads, I made sure to prepare the sewing machine well. So I changed the needle to a new one, ensuring it was as sharp as possible and wouldn't damage the fabric. Then it was time to sew. Another thing I did, because the fabric is so slippery, was to pin the bodice pieces before sewing. With the sharp points in the pattern, I had to make sure everything was sewn perfectly, and even though I don't usually like pinning, it was the right choice here. After each seam, I pressed everything carefully to ensure the seams looked crisp and the seam allowance stayed flat. Since the fabric didn't like being shaped, I had to let it cool with some weight on top to prevent any shifting. This meant I only made slow progress, but seeing the results made it worth it. I continued to sew all the pieces together and ironed them in between until I had completed the bodice from the satin fabric. Next, I took out the corset again and carefully pinned everything together, making sure all the seams lined up before sewing it. Since I hadn't planned on using a seam allowance at the top to attach something when I made the corset, I didn't really have one, so I had to improvise a bit. But I think it turned out okay. After sewing both parts together, I tried to shape the neckline as best as I could. This was done by carefully ironing the top, making sure to let each section cool off while still holding its shape, and by waiting until everything was completely set before moving it again. Once the neckline was finished, I put the corset on the mannequin to secure the outer layer properly. First, I pinned the back panel right to the edge of the lacing panel. This will later be covered by the watteau pleats, so I don't mind leaving the lacing panel white for now. After securing the back, I did the same with the bottom, pinning both layers together to keep everything as smooth as possible. When I was happy with the result, I hand sewed both layers together. I prefer to do it this way because taking it off and using the machine would risk shifting something, and the boning would make it difficult to sew all around. And then it was time for the skirt. I started by putting the petticoat from the initial dress onto the mannequin. If you're interested in how I made it, you can go back and watch the video if you like. Over this, I put the corset again. First, I had to determine exactly where I wanted the skirt to be added. To do this, I pinned a line on one side and transferred it to the other side by measuring the correct length from the top down. This took some back and forth until I was satisfied and both sides were identical. Then I replaced the pins with basting thread, making it easier to add the skirt later without worrying about sewing over the pins. I added the basting threads on both sides, removing all the pins along the way. To start on the skirt, I measured the exact length and angle it would have, and then it was time to cut all 3 skirt panels from the fabric. Here I made sure to use large panels so I could easily reuse the fabric for other projects, as I already have something in my mind I want to make for myself. After marking the correct length and cutting out the pieces, I laid both side pieces on top of each other and traced the angle I measured from the bodice earlier. After adding some safety pins to mark the halfway point for later, I added gathering threads to the top of those pieces. Then, both side pieces were sewn together with the back piece to create one large skirt panel. This was then pinned onto the corset, using the basting from earlier as a guide. I divided the fabric evenly and pinned it along the skirt line before pulling the gathering thread and sewing everything together. The last big step was to pin the watteau pleats in the back. I made sure both sides were even with the same number of pleats, before removing the dress from the mannequin one last time to sew the final seams, remove all the pins and get it ready for the reveal. And here it is, the final dress. I'm really happy with how it turned out. I like the look of it much more than the previous version, and I also think it feels a lot more like me, if that makes sense. I wanted to achieve an autumn-themed dress with a lot of drama, and I think I pulled it off. I'm not 100% happy with it because the way I constructed the corset wasn't really meant for an extra layer, which caused some trouble, especially at the neckline. But overall I'm really pleased with the dress, so I call it a success. I took something I wasn't really happy with and turned it into a designer love. And maybe I'll get the chance to make this as a dress with a proper construction at some point. What do you think? Have you seen the previous version and do you agree? Or do you prefer the white dress? If you haven't seen the other video, what do you think of this dress? Does it look like it's had a complete makeover? Let me know. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, feel free to like it and subscribe to my channel. And until next time.